We're going to unravel the layers of faith woven throughout history. He didn't drink green beer, he wasn't a leprechaun or an elf, and he didn't kiss a Blarney Stone. Who was he? He was Patrick, St. Patrick. Today we're going to talk about this amazing life, Patrick of Ireland, and how what he did was more valuable than a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. Millions of lives were affected for Christ through Patrick. Stay tuned.
Here is the question of the day, which will be answered at the end of today's program. What do Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin have in common?
St. Patrick, one of the most interesting people in history. We're going to talk about his amazing life from tragedy to triumph, but we need to get a setting for when he lived. Patrick lived at a time when the Roman Empire was in decline. The Roman Empire, which had lasted from around 700 BC to 476 AD, was when it officially fell. Over 1,000 years. What was happening in this great empire around the time that Patrick was born? Well, Rome had grown to extreme limits. It had been in Africa, been in the Holy Land, through the Germanic areas of Europe called Gaul, all the way up to Britain. And Hadrian's Wall is still there. Hadrian was the Roman emperor who extended the boundaries of Rome to its uttermost limits. And after that, Rome began to contract. And so Hadrian built walls to mark the furthest extent of the Roman Empire. Well, one of the things that was happening at the time that Patrick lived was that the Roman Empire had become top-heavy. It had a whole lot of people that were dependent on the government. Matter of fact, they had a bureaucracy where it was the people working for the government were on a dole, and the government would have a welfare program. Almost the entire city of Rome was on welfare, and the rest of the Roman Empire had to support them. One of the Roman historians wrote this: "Those who live at the expense of public funds are more numerous than those who provide them." So there weren't enough people paying taxes, but everybody was getting their support from the government. And then the Roman Empire had a trade deficit. That meant that they were importing their crops from North Africa, and they were not producing the goods right in Rome, in Italy itself. But then Rome was being invaded by illegal immigrants. But back then, they were the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. These were these Germanic tribes. And then there were the Franks and the Lombards and the Jutes and the Burgundians and the Anglos and the Saxons. And these different groups began to cross the borders into Rome. They had their version of the Rio Grande, so to speak. It was the Rhine River. And one winter, the Rhine froze. And some of the Visigoths began crossing over. And then they went back. And nobody attacked them, and so some more went over. And then they decided to stay, and the next spring came, and the next fall came, and the next winter came, and so they stayed, and they began to take over these different areas. Now, at first, when they crossed over, some of them would assimilate into Roman life, and they would learn the Roman Latin language, and would become servants. One of the groups that became servants a lot were Eastern Europeans, known as Slavs. That's where we get the term Yugoslav or Czechoslovakia or Slovenia. The Slav is a term for a people, and a glorious one. But the Romans, through the centuries, had so many of these Slavs that came and worked as servants. Matter of fact, many of them were captured and were forced to work as servants, that the word Slav got pronounced slave. So the word slave comes from the word Slav because the Romans had captured and made servants so many of those Eastern Europeans. But as these different tribes would cross over the Roman borders, they began to isolate themselves and learn less of the Latin language and keep their own language. And that's where we get the languages of German and French and English, or Angles. And so they mixed in a little bit of the Latin, sort of like a Tex-Mex mix. And that's why we call those Western European languages Romantic languages, because they had a little of the Roman language, the Latin language in them. They're not necessarily romantic because lovers would speak those languages. They just had a Roman root, a Latin verb structure. Anyway, as these different groups came in, after a while, they would start to overrun the city of Rome itself. And so Latin no longer was the national language of Rome. And then they began to have problems with attacks. The Roman Empire was so big, the Scots and the Picts were attacking up in Britain. The Berbers were attacking in North Africa. And then there were the different tribes attacking through Europe. One of them was Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun was the terrorist of the day. These terrorist attacks, Attila would ride in with his men on horseback and would wipe out whole cities of 75,000 people. The Christians at the time thought that Attila was the Antichrist. And these were such a barbaric people that they would actually scar the faces of their little boys so that when they grew up, their beards would look all scraggly and ugly so that they would look scarier as warriors. And they would live on horseback and ride. They were excellent horsemen. And they would sometimes take a piece of meat and stick it under the leg to warm it up before they'd eat it. And these Huns would come in and just wipe out different cities across Europe. So that was their version of terrorists. And then Roman military was very high-tech, but relatively small. And they could move it quickly anywhere in the Roman Empire along a road system. And that's where we get the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. And one of these road systems, the Appian Way, there are still portions of it that are there today. So I had the privilege of going to school in Italy in college. And we could go out and see part of the old Roman aqueducts where they would bring water into the city of Rome. But you could see the roads that were still there. And so this was allowed the Roman military to move very quickly. It's sort of interesting that the road system in America was built under the military. It was Dwight Eisenhower that pushed it through Congress so that we could move troops from one part of America to another quickly. And so that the idea actually came from the Germans, that they built the limited access highways and one lane going one direction and one lane going the other. So the military advantage of a road system, but the Romans were the pioneers of this high-tech. It was their version of F-16s, of Air Force, where they could move very quickly from one end of the empire to the other, but they couldn't sustain long and drawn-out military engagements. And so that caused the financial pressure on the Roman Empire. A little bit of an interesting side note on the Roman road system. The Roman soldiers had an average step of 5.28 feet. So when they would march, from the time that one heel touched to the same time that heel did, it was 5.28 feet. And so every 1,000 steps, they would put a 1,000-step marker alongside of their road. Well, 5.28 step by 1,000 is 5,280 feet, which is the length of a mile. And the Italian Latin word for 1,000 is mille. M-I-L-E, mile. So the length of our mile today is the length that a Roman soldier would take 1,000 steps. And so we still have this remnant of the Roman Empire on the speedometers of all of our cars, at least in America. But so then we have this situation where the Roman Empire had to raise taxes to support these expensive military endeavors. And with the whole entire city of Rome on welfare, that's when the historian Salvian said tax collectors became greedy functionaries in a bureaucracy so huge and corrupt that the tax collector was described as more terrible than the enemy. So yes, we have these barbarians attacking, but we have these tax collectors attacking. And so the citizens of Rome were squeezed between the two of them. And so we have this situation where this huge empire, the largest in the world up until that time, was now beginning to suffer. And that's where Edward Gibbons, the one historian, said Rome fell from the inside, that it began to crumble and lose its sense of identity. A couple other things that were interesting was the trade deficit. Now, a trade deficit is when you trade with another country and buy more of their goods and they buy less of your goods. Well, Rome had outsourced its grain production to North Africa. And so where Carthage and so forth, this is where the grain was grown and it was shipped back into Italy. But one of those tribes that had overrun the Roman Empire was called the Vandals. That's, believe it or not, that was the name of the tribe, the Vandals. And when they would come through town, you can guess what they did. They vandalized. They just loved to arbitrarily destroy things. And so that's where we get the word today, vandalism. And so these Vandals, when they sacked Rome in around 455 AD, and Rome was sacked several times, but the final time was 476. But the Vandals went through North Africa and captured the grain fields. And so this cut off the supplies, so Rome could not have a defensive tactic. It would be very similar today. We've outsourced so much of our production to China that if China decided to hold their ships back for a few months, our Western economy would be brought to its knees. There would not be any products to sell in Walmart or any of the department stores, and so you wouldn't need any employees to work at those stores, and there wouldn't people would start rioting in the streets. And so just as Rome allowed itself to be put into this precarious position because it had outsourced, so has America put itself in that position. So we're sort of examining some of the situations that took place in the Roman Empire that are sort of similar to what's happening today in Western civilization. Now, the church did exist at the time. The church, obviously, was started around 33 AD when Jesus died and rose again, and then the Holy Spirit came down on the day of Pentecost, and thousands were saved that first week. And then they went back to all four corners of the world, including the Roman Empire. So Rome had a group of Christians. For the first 3 centuries of Rome, the Romans were killing the Christians. There were 10 major persecutions in the first 300 years of Christianity. Sort of interesting, for whatever reason, God allowed his church to be born into a one world government, the Roman Empire. But the church won, and eventually the Roman Empire fell, and the church survived throughout the Middle Ages. But nevertheless, during this time, there were Christian leaders that were trying to stop the immorality, but they were not successful. And so that's one of the reasons why Rome became corrupted. But listen to this one historian. It says, the church, while preaching against the abuse and corruption, contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire by discouraging good Christians from holding public office. It was this idea that if you're a really holy person, you don't want to get involved in the corrupt politics. And so consequently, who was in charge of politics but the corrupt people? So it's sort of a dilemma. But the military was then cut to a dangerously low level. They were cutting back, sort of like today, where we're closing down military bases, supposedly to save money, but then they're moving those different military regiments to different other bases and building brand new facilities there at the next base. So we see this trend happening where Rome was cutting back its military, being invaded with illegal immigrants who at first assimilated but then decided not to and kept their own languages. Their taxes had to be raised to support the welfare programs and the military. They had a trade deficit where they were bringing more stuff in and growing less of it on their own soil. And then they had injustice in the legal system, where it basically was only if you could afford to have a really good attorney, or if you were wealthy, or if you had a position of prominence, did you get fairness in a court. But then there were the moral differences. And we're going to look at the moral decay of Rome in just a minute. It's a fascinating mirror of what we see happening right here in Western civilization. So as we go to this next subject, you won't want to miss what happened in Rome in its final days. St. Patrick lived at the time the Roman Empire was falling. He was up there in Britain, kidnapped to Ireland, but Rome was being attacked by Attila the Hun. But one of the historians said Rome fell from the inside. And we're going to examine that right now to see what was going on with the morals in Rome. You won't want to miss this. So the Roman Empire, which had existed for 1,000 years, had become Christian a large percentage of the reason because Constantine had converted to Christianity in 313 AD. Now, Constantine was one of the generals in Rome, and there were 10 major persecutions of Christians in the first 300 years, and the 10th was the worst. Diocletian was the emperor, and he actually erected a memorial to the extermination of Christianity. And Diocletian went province by province, arresting church leaders and killing them. Well, the church prayed, and on May 1st, 305 AD, Diocletian was struck with an intestinal disease so painful, he abdicated his throne. And you have to appreciate the poetic humor in this, because the emperors at the time had been declaring themselves a god with a little g, sprinkling gold dust in their hair and demanding that their image be worshipped. And so when Diocletian stepped down, it was sort of like a god resigning from being a god. He went to what is today Croatia or Dalmatian coast, which was Yugoslavia for a while, and he built a palace and took up farming. But Galerius took over as the next emperor. He continued the persecution of Christians, and he was struck with an intestinal disease, and he died. So it came down to 4 generals. And in Rome, the soldiers pledged allegiance to their general, not to the country. And so when an emperor would die without a successor, the generals would sort of fight each other off, and the one with the biggest army would declare himself the next emperor. And if you didn't like it, come and fight him. And long story short, Constantine, the night before the battle, saw the sign of Christ in the sky. The Chi Rho, the first 2 Greek letters for Christ. Chi is the X symbol, and then Rho looks like a P, but it has the R sound. So they're the first 2 Ka-Ra, the Christ, the first 2 letters of Christ, the Chi Rho. And we've seen that in history with the X and a P, those first 2 letters, on a lot of church artwork. And so Constantine put the first 2 letters of Christ on all of his symbols and his shields and standards, and he won the battle. And so he legalized Christianity for the first time in history in 313 AD. And so the Roman Empire had Christians there, but there still was paganism, and there still was immorality that the church was trying to fight. Well, what was some of this immorality? Well, some of it was the violent entertainment. That for centuries, Romans had violent entertainment in their colosseums, killing to the death. And different writers say that even those that hated the murder, when they would get into the stadium and they'd be caught up in that frenzy, sort of like a football game, and everybody cheering, except instead of cheering your player across the goal, they were murdering people, and people would get caught up in this bloodlust. And eventually, there was a Christian monk that went to Rome and felt called of God, and he said, in the name of Christ, stop. He went to the Colosseums, and of course they're all cheering, and he works his way down to the fence, and he says, in the name of Christ, stop, and they still wouldn't stop, so he jumps over into the ring, and he says, in the name of Christ, stop, and finally everybody's quiet and looking at him, what's this little monk doing down there? And then the soldier, the gladiator, kills him, and his last words were, in the name of Christ, stop, and then someone left the Colosseum, and then another person left, and another, till finally they all filtered out, and that was around 400 AD, and that was the last gladiatorial event, the murdering for spectators to watch. Anyway, But the Rome still had this underlying current of a battle. Sort of like today you have the cultural battle between the morals and the Christian virtues and the ones wanting to push this immorality. Well, another immorality was their bathhouses. They had their gymnasiums and bathhouses. Now, you say, what's wrong with a gymnasium? Well, gym, G-Y-M, is the Greek word for naked. So a gymnasium was where a bunch of naked guys ran around, and it ended up with a lot of sexual immorality and homosexual sex. And so they'd have jacuzzis and slaves under the ground stoking the fires to keep the jacuzzis bubbling. And of course, the Jews and Christians who were circumcised wouldn't go in there. But nevertheless, these were dens of immorality. And this is what the 5th century historian Salvian said. He said, "O Roman people, be ashamed of your lives. Almost no cities are free of evil dens or altogether free of impurities, except the cities where the barbarians have begun to live. Let no one think otherwise. The vices of our bad lives have alone destroyed us." So the vices of the bad lives, that Rome fell from the inside. And they even had a tradition of immorality of Pompeii, which was destroyed a couple centuries earlier, but they still had this immorality where you look through the ruins and they would have a room at the front of a business where a prostitute would do favors for customers. And in Pompeii, they unearthed all these whole culture, sort of like Las Vegas, but only the prostitution was absolutely horrible there. And this is what Salvian, the historian, wrote: "The Goths lie, but are chaste. The Franks lie, but are admirable in generosity. The Saxons are savage in cruelty, but admirable in chastity. What hope can there be for the Romans when the barbarians are more pure than they?" Wow. And then there was even this tradition of exposure of unwanted infants, sort of their version of abortion. And so in the Roman culture, the father had life and death power over his kids, even until they were almost grown. But the mother would bear the child and set it at the father's feet, and if he picked it up and liked it, they'd keep it. If he didn't like it, the mother would have to get rid of it and put it in some pagan temple where it would die, or out in the woods where it would get killed by wild animals. But often, Christians would hear these babies crying and rescue them and raise them in orphanages. And there's many inspiring stories of some of them becoming great preachers. But we sort of see that Rome was losing its moral footing, and Christians were trying to fight this, but sort of like in Western civilization today, it still goes down that slide. And unfortunately, when this happened is when the terrorist attacks began to attack with Attila the Hun. The Roman borders got overrun. Their government was so in debt because of all these military campaigns in the Holy Land, and so they began to crumble under this huge debt. And that's when Rome had to pull its legions, its soldiers, back from the frontiers, like Britain. And so Britain, a Roman colony, was now left unprotected after around 407 AD. And so here you have a Roman city that was not protected, and different Viking-type people would attack and carry away these Romans into slavery. And one of them was Patrick. And we're going to talk more about this amazing life of St. Patrick.
Now, here's the answer to today's question. What do Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin have in common? Their birthdays. Both Lincoln and Darwin were born on February 12, 1809, but their lives were different. Darwin is known for the theory of evolution, arguing that men are not created, but they are evolved, and that men are not equal, as some are more evolved than others. In his Descent of Man, 1871, Darwin wrote, quote, "Civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate the savage races. The break between man in a more civilized state, as the Caucasian, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla," unquote. Lincoln, on the other hand, is known for freeing the slaves, affirming in his Gettysburg Address, 1863, quote, "A new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal," unquote. Lincoln wrote on April 6, 1859, quote, "He who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it." Unquote.
St. Patrick. I actually wrote a book. It's entitled St. Patrick, The Real Story of His Amazing Life from Tragedy to Triumph. And in one of Patrick's writings, he says, "And the Lord brought over us the wrath of his anger and scattered us amongst the nations, even unto the uttermost part of the earth, where my littleness is now placed among strangers." So Patrick was taken captive. He was around 16 years old. And another place Patrick writes about how this happened. And when you study the history, it's amazing. He says, "I, Patrick, a sinner, an unlearned man to be sure, the least faithful and utterly despised. My father was Calpurnus, a deacon, son of Pontius, a priest in the Christian faith, in the village of Bonvernay Tabernay, which is a Roman city and sort of hard to decide which English city that would be today. Anyway, he goes on to say, there I was taken captive, and I was about 16 years of age, and I did not know the true God. I was taken into captivity to Ireland with many thousands of other people, and deservedly so, because we turned away from God and did not keep his commandments." And he says, "As a youth, nay, almost as a boy, not able to speak, I was taken captive before I knew what to pursue and what to avoid." So here's Patrick, 16 years old, a Briton, a Roman, taken captive to Ireland. And it's a fascinating story that we're going to get into in the next session together on what happened in Patrick's life in Ireland and how did he turn the situation around where he found Ireland heathen and left it Christian, and ended up baptizing 120,000 people and starting 300 churches. An amazing story where this huge Roman Empire was crumbling from the inside and being overrun with terrorist attacks from the outside, but a 16-year-old boy had faith in the Lord in the midst of it, and we still remember him today. See you next time.
This has been a TCT Network exclusive production. If you would like to see more exclusive special programs, send your support to TCT, P.O. Box 1010, Marion, Illinois, 62959.